And I believe Lee Harvey Oswald did shoot at Kennedy's motorcade in Dallas. I believe he also hit his target. I am intrigued by the possibility, however, that there were other parties involved.
Donald Trump has pledged to declassify all sorts of documents about the assassination attempts, successful assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Sr., and JFK. And this is causing, a lot of shockwaves in the States. People are very excited about what some of these documents could tell us about these assassinations. I'll start with JFK because that's the most interesting one. Who killed JFK?
Well, I'd like to start with something else, which is by comparing the three assassinations and isolating why it is that one is so interesting to us. So you have three killings. President John F. Kennedy in Dallas in November 1963. Martin Luther King in Memphis in April 1968. And then Senator Robert F. Kennedy in June 1968 in Los Angeles. And you have three killers. Lee Harvey Oswald shoots Kennedy. James Earl Ray shoots Martin Luther King in a motel. And Sirhan Sirhan shoots Robert F. Kennedy, also in a hotel. Two of these three enter guilty pleas and are convicted. And in both of those cases, a motive is established. James Earl Ray is a violent criminal and racist Southerner who buys a rifle and bullets under a false name and therefore has both motive and what we might call a logic as well, when viewed externally, for wanting to kill Martin Luther King. Sirhan Sirhan describes himself when arrested as having done this because Robert F. Kennedy supported Israel in the 1967 war. He later said that he had a 20-year motive for doing it, i.e. the existence of Israel. He was of Palestinian origin himself, was in itself a motive. And in his journal, had written Kennedy has to die by June the 5th, 1968, and so on. This doesn't apply in the case of Lee Harvey Oswald. Oswald's motive wasn't clearly established at the time by his words or anybody else's. Oswald, as we know, was himself assassinated 2 days after Kennedy's assassination in the basement parking garage of the Dallas police headquarters, where he'd been held by a man called Jack Ruby. So the Oswald case is exceptional for that reason. We don't have a clear motive, and there are a series of weird and open-ended questions which you don't have to wear a tin hat in order to be interested in them, is what I would say. I would add a fourth assassination to that, actually, which is Malcolm X, who is assassinated in a ballroom in Manhattan, New York in 1965. President Trump doesn't seem to want to open the files on that one, which to me is interesting, and I think he should, because there are similar questions about the assassination of Malcolm X as there are about the JFK and Martin Luther King assassinations, less so in the case of Robert F. Kennedy. So if you were to rank these in reverse order of questions to be asked, to my mind, the least controversial of these would probably be the assassinations of Malcolm X and Robert F. Kennedy. There are very clear motives, to the point that Louis Farrakhan said, it was basically, he'd been part of it, that the Nation of Islam had thought Malcolm X had got out of line and it was their business to deal with it, as he described it. So that's a fairly straightforward thing. And again, in the case of Robert F. Kennedy, Sirhan Sirhan, again, confessed to it. No serious alternative has been suggested, though RFK Jr. has, of course, said that having spoken to Sound, he does believe actually there was a second shooter, but no evidence or material that could constitute a kind of evidence has yet come to light. And in the case of Martin Luther King's assassination, again, it's very clear that James L. Ray fired the gun. He later claimed to have been set up. His family believed that as well, the King family. But again, no material that could constitute evidence to back that up has come to light. Now, in all of those other three assassinations, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Robert F. Kennedy, there is a question of what did the federal agencies and local police and state police know? Because they're watching dubious characters all the time. And that is one of the known unknowns that runs through the Kennedy case as well. But as I say, again, the Kennedy case is very strange because we know who all the other killers were. And we're still not really sure what kind of person Lee Harvey Oswald was. That's before we get to the questions of whether he acted alone. So to return in a very long and rambling way to your initial question, I believe, as a historian, you're meant to take Occam's razor, the shortest and most direct explanation. And I believe Lee Harvey Oswald did shoot at Kennedy's motorcade in Dallas. I believe he also hit his target. I am intrigued by the possibility, however, that there were other parties involved. And Gallup, the pollsters, have taken a poll every year in the United States since the weeks after the assassination. They do it annually. And a majority of Americans have doubted that Oswald acted alone. In other words, there was more than one actor in this. In other words, a conspiracy, as people say. So for a start, I think we should say that merely, as they say, just asking questions is in itself, it shouldn't be viewed as a sign of mental instability or something, or conspiracizing. And I would say, I believe that the footage of the moon landings is real. I don't believe in little green men. I believe from the off that COVID-19 probably did come from a laboratory in Wuhan, because that is literally the shortest and most obvious explanation. I think we should always try and resist elaborate explanations, but I do know pretty surely, I would say, that we are missing crucial pieces of information that would settle these questions one way or another. And I will give you a chance to say something before I come to my pet theory, which everybody has one, and then you can tell me your pet theory.
The JFK assassination is probably the most interesting one, because with all the other assassinations, as you say, we pretty much know who did it, particularly with Robert F. Kennedy. There were lots of witnesses. It happened in a very crowded, I believe, kitchen in the hotel as he was leaving after he won this great victory in the Democratic primaries in California. And I think the guy who killed Robert F. Kennedy later also sort of backtracked and said that he was set up and so on. And tried
people
to
on death row and in life prison, they do tend to lie. I mean, that's the thing. They do often acquit themselves of things that everybody knows they've done. And I have to say also, the families of the dead naturally are looking for motives, just as the perpetrators are looking to get out of it. The families are looking for explanations, and therefore they are susceptible to that as well. So when we note that the King family, RFK Jr., Malcolm X's widow, Betty Shabazz, for instance, when they come up with more elaborate explanations, again, there is an understandable motive there for that kind of behavior.
Well, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is, very skeptical of the official line on a lot of things, isn't he? So, I'm sure that he would be very suspicious of the so-called official story around his father's death. And interestingly enough, all three figures, they had lots of powerful enemies, and people could point to, J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, and look at his spying on Martin Luther King. And I'm sure that Robert F. Kennedy, as Attorney General, had lots of enemies in the mob and the mafia that he went after in his career. And JFK, the idea is that he had lots of enemies in the CIA and within the American government, but also enemies abroad. And I've even seen in the last few days Tucker Carlson doing interviews about what could be declassified in the JFK files to do with Israel's potential involvement. So maybe you can talk a bit about why these men are so controversial, and what kind of enemies they had, and who might have been behind their murders if they did have these sort of conspiracies.
I think Tucker Carlson has lost his marbles in some way. The first president to send advanced American munitions to the state of Israel was JFK. There's not much evidence of any kind to suggest he felt any differently, and the fact is that the urgencies of the Cold War wouldn't have had any great effect either. So I just don't see that. I think Tucker is cracked, and he has a problem which he's making vast amounts of money by acting out to credulous people. My understanding of this is, before we go to my understanding, I'll answer the next question is, when we look at it and say cui bono, who benefits? The problem is, who was the great beneficiary of the killing of Robert F. Kennedy? Well, it was the person who was running second for the Democratic nomination in 1968. But did George McGovern have anything to do with the killing of Kennedy? Of course not. There's nothing remotely suggestive of that. Similarly, Oliver Stone, who is a crank and a crackpot and has literally drunk the Kool-Aid too many times, Oliver Stone's movie, JFK, ends with Lyndon B. Johnson because he goes, up a step and becomes the president after JFK's killing. So merely asking who benefits isn't really enough, I think, in these situations. Most people who assassinate major figures do it for specific political reasons or out of wacky personal motives. And if I can read from the list, the other presidents, Lincoln in 1865 is shot by John Wilkes Booth, who is an actor of some status, not a failed actor in the way Hitler was a failed painter, but a well-known actor who was a Confederate on the losing side and a racist, and therefore shot Lincoln. In 1881, President Garfield is shot by Charles Guiteau, who basically is a frustrated writer who believes that that Garfield hasn't credited him with the speech that he wrote, and so he shoots him. Everyone's a critic. In other words, that's a highly personal motive, not a political one like John Wilkes Booth. And then in 1901, President McKinley is killed by an anarchist for specifically political motives. And again, in Sirhan Sirhan's case, there's a specifically political motive. 1968 is the year, in fact, in which Palestinian terrorism forces the Palestinians' issue into the national headlines, airplane hijackings and so on. So it's not that remarkable that Sirhan Sirhan would therefore commit what most people would call the first serious act of Palestinian terrorism on American soil. The killing of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, is the Nation of Islam commits a political execution of someone who's gone rogue. And again, we can view that as one of the first acts of serious Islamist violence with political effects in United States history. The killing of JFK, we keep coming back to because there are so many potential motives in the absence of knowing why Lee Harvey Oswald did it. So we have to then, run through not just who benefits, which is, one way of looking at it, but who hates him and who hates him to the point of having an ideological or personal grudge.
With John F. Kennedy, it was so quick that the conclusion came from J. Edgar Hoover, again, the head of the FBI at the time, the director, that this was a lone gunman. I think it was within hours that he was telling Lyndon Johnson and others that, this was not a conspiracy and it was limited to Lee Harvey Oswald. And that immediately created suspicion because Lyndon Johnson, he initiates the Warren Commission, which comes to this same conclusion. And then there's later the church hearings in Congress, which sort of re-examines the evidence. And just from the get-go, there was conspiracies, coming all around because, as you say, this guy was killed so quickly after the assassination that, that created a vacuum. So I just wonder, what in your mind are the questions that are still outstanding? What kind of bugs you?
Number one, we have no clear understanding of Lee Harvey Oswald's motives, and that includes the fact that his interrogation in the Dallas police station, the originals of the interrogation transcripts, do not exist. These are the most important transcripts of any interrogation, I think, since the Nuremberg trials of 1945, and it got lost. How that happened is just bizarre. I mean, I know bureaucracy is incompetent, but this taxes one's, imagination to believe it simply got lost. That's number one, I think, and that is very much to do with motive. Number two is how Jack Ruby was able to get into the Dallas police station, which was the most significant site in the world, holding the most important suspect in the world at the time, and he was able to wander in and out of it for one day and then return in order to shoot Oswald at point-blank range in the parking garage as he was being transferred. That suggests that he had a motive for getting into the station and was aided in that by a corrupt policeman. Corruption within the Dallas Police Department is a matter of record at the time. The third question I would like to know about is Jack Ruby himself. In his trial, and he had stomach cancer, which would kill him a few years later, he said he'd done it as a patriotic American because he didn't want to see Jackie Kennedy having to take the stand. Jack Ruby in real life had been a lifelong enforcer for the mob in Chicago and had gone to Dallas to run its operations there. So that it was something which the Warren Commission, strangely enough, didn't talk about. And I can keep going with that. We know that before the assassination, that the CIA had worked with the mafia. This was something interesting. The Church Commission confirmed in the 1970s hearings. Those relationships seem to have some kind of background relationship to the mood and the chatter around the killing of JFK. And then there is the Cuban exile community, which, the CIA had trained up and for the disastrous Bay of Pigs landing just before, and then had been ordered to drop when Kennedy took off, after the Bay of Pigs failure, rather. Kennedy told them to drop that and drop attempts to kill Castro. So we don't know enough about the political context, and that is the political context that we should look at, as well as the antagonism between Bobby Kennedy and the mafia. We don't know enough about those contexts to be able to completely remove them from our explanations. So it's not surprising that the speculation has attacked this from the off. My suspicion, well, firstly, I strongly suspect that the documents which will be released will not give us the answer. There is not going to be a piece of paper somewhere in the CIA in a nice little manila folder saying, "Dear so-and-so, please go to Dallas and shoot the president." That is not how these things go, unless you're executing the president of another country, in which case there may well be a paper trail. But there's not going to be that, and what there is going to be heavily redacted, as we saw with the previous batch. But we may find out interesting things anyway about the politics of the time. The other thing I strongly suspect is a phrase that we are used to hearing now may be the one that we apply to JFK's assassination. And that phrase is known to the authorities. Because these days, when there is an Islamist atrocity somewhere, it emerges pretty quickly, or pretty slowly, if the authorities are managing it in their preferred manner, that the person concerned was known to the authorities. And that means they had either engaged in some kind of deviant behavior before, and had been, as we now say, on the radar, or even that they had been picked up and had informed to some degree on a radical network and so on. And this kind of ambivalent thing where people are members of a network but also talking to the authorities is extremely common. when it comes to terrorists. It's very common when it comes to organized crime. Despite our image of it, of course, the mafia, certainly in more recent decades, is riddled with informants who always try to negotiate avoiding a life sentence by running in their friends. So I believe that one strong motive there was for saying that it was a straightforward assassination by a lone nutter is that Oswald was known to the authorities, which he certainly was, because he had defected to the Soviet Union at the peak of the Cold War, and they'd come back. And that other actors that we sort of, whose names repeatedly come up, mobsters, Cubans, and so on, and people who had worked for the CIA in a sort of deniable manner, and so on, that these people too were known to the authorities. And perhaps now we are very habituated to that idea. But at the time, I think it would have been a great novelty and a great distressing one for the federal authorities of the United States to say this terrible thing that happened despite the fact we knew this guy was a wrong 'un. And not only that we knew some of the people who he was connected to and who Ruby was connected to were also wrong 'uns. And that some of them had actually been doing odd jobs on the quiet for agencies of the United States government in the interests of national security and so on. And they're wrong 'uns too. And what kind of person would engage a wrong 'un to do the wrong thing? Well, it would kind of reflect that the agencies themselves might have been wrong 'uns. And that, I believe, is why Mike Pompeo, according to Donald Trump, blocked the release of some of the papers, because it would reflect very badly on the intelligence services, on the CIA in particular, who probably knew. And as I said, I think at the time that would have been shocking enough in its own. You'd want to suppress that. So we're not going to find out about who was on the grassy knoll, or if anyone relevant to our inquiries was there. But I do believe we will get a fairer inkling of what might have driven the authorities to push what turned out to be an untenable and unconvincing theory. Even if it's true, it hasn't convinced people. And perhaps also to find out more about the contexts that lead people to suspect there is more to it.
It's interesting that the main conspiracy, or one of the main conspiracies around the shooting of JFK, is the idea that there were only 3 shots fired. And this is because they found 3 bullet cartridges, cases, whatever they're called. And the official line is that, one of the bullets went through JFK and into John Connolly, who was the governor of Texas at the time, and he became disabled from his wounds. And a lot of people were sort of quite suspicious of this. And as you say, the grassy knoll famously, people are very suspicious that are not there were more bullets flying around. Is this something of interest to you, or do you think this is this could have just been people hearing things, or what do you think?
Well, Governor Connolly, who was shot, by Oswald, believes that the single bullet theory isn't tenable. I mean, for what that's worth, maybe that's like the family members who are looking for an explanation and are drawn to certain things. I mean, anyone who watches the Zapruder film, which you can see, I believe, online, it's very hard to believe that Kennedy is shot from behind in that film. And the fact that large parts of his head flew backwards, which is why Jackie Kennedy climbed out of the car, she said, to retrieve parts of his brain and skull. That would suggest also that he was shot from another angle. And I'm not an expert in ballistics, and I know that the tests of sound recordings have come up with both pro and con, results for larger numbers of bullets and multiple firings, acoustic analysis and so on. I would say that we wouldn't be asking those questions if the straightforward Oswald did it explanation held up. So I would like to know much, much more. I'm not entirely convinced. A friend of mine, we were talking about this, and a journalist, and he said, I'm conspiracy curious when it comes to this. And I would say that there is a lot of evidence suggesting that a lot of people wanted to shoot Kennedy and may have even talked together about it. And conspiring, by the way, I mean, the word comes from Latin. It means literally to whisper together. And there were wiretaps of mobsters saying, Kennedy's they've got to go because RFK had been on a campaign to destroy the mob, and the mob had helped JFK win office in 1960, particularly in the West Virginia primary, but also allegedly in the Chicago count, and had then turned on them in their understanding. So a lot of people had whispered very hostile things together about wanting to kill him. So merely talking about conspiracy in that sense, I say, it doesn't make you a nutter. It actually means you've simply been reading the FBI's own wiretaps. And similarly, in the killing of Martin Luther King, there is a great deal of chatter about it, and there is evidence of people talking and so on. So when you say, was there a conspiracy around James Earl Ray, or the chances are, you could say, well, not in the concrete terms we would usually talk about it, like a bunch of people sitting in a room saying this is how we're going to pull it off, but there was a great deal of people around him who he agreed with, who had similar motives, who were whispering together about it, and they were being wiretapped and infiltrated, as we still see. I mean, I think we saw it after 9/11, when it emerged that there had been information that both the CIA and FBI had warnings in advance, and that they had failed, partly for interagency rivalry, but also because it was technically illegal for them to collaborate, like that. They had failed to coordinate and share and correctly value the information. This is one other thing we have to remember. Modern governments accumulate absurd quantities of paper, or wiretaps of information, and how you sift it and assign value and actually sculpt a piece of a jigsaw that you don't yet know its image or outline is not a straightforward thing at all. It's embarrassing for the agencies, of course, which have vast budgets and status and so on, and would like to be indispensable. But it is actually a fact. It's very hard to invent that jigsaw on the fly, which is what we expect them to do, to be able to weigh the value of every single piece of information correctly and understand how it relates to every other. So yes, there is always chatter before a major terrorist event. The fact that we know there's chatter indicates that people are being surveilled and listened to, and that information is being gathered. And we are accustomed now to the idea that simply gathering it all is not enough to guarantee that we understand it. And in the 1960s, I don't think that was yet, as we say, normalized. I think the intelligence agencies expected better of themselves. The public certainly did. And so there was a motive. In fact, talking of motives, there was a motive to preserve the dignity of the agencies. And this, of course, is part of the shadow battle which is going on now. Just as Mike Pompeo wanted to preserve the dignity of the agency if he said to Trump, no, we shouldn't release everything, RFK, Trump himself, these are people who all say, no, the intelligence community has far too large a part in political life for what's meant to be a liberal democracy. And also intelligence community is not very good at what it's doing, and therefore needs to have some sunlight brought in order to make it, more efficient at doing the things that we actually don't want it to do, which seems to me to be very paradoxical. We want the intelligence community to guarantee our safety, yet we don't want it to be too good at doing the things which are essential for our safety. Maybe that's just baked into the cake of having a free society that requires, protection. So there is a shadow battle going on here. I think Robert F. Kennedy Jr., he's somebody who was basically a fruitcake until the day before yesterday. I think in Trump world there is a great pressure to get with the program and get on side, because it's understandable, because so much American politics is a winner-takes-all ideological war. Therefore, the fact that he's got into the trench recommends him enough. His judgment on lots of things is not that great. So for that alone, I to believe him on this. I personally opened out and aired, and it would perhaps not be a great tragedy if we came to the conclusion that total safety and total protection by the intelligence services or any other agency of government isn't actually possible, and that the safetiest world in which we live is not workable or tolerable.
It's interesting. You talk about the CIA, potentially being worried about being embarrassed by some of these files. You can see that happening because in the 60s, the 50s, we know that the CIA was involved in some very, very dodgy, corrupt things, coups all around the world, MK Ultra, Operation Paperclip. People will have heard these phrases, but, this is real. And then, even later on, the 1980s, you had the Iran-Contra, scandal. And the FBI and the CIA were both involved in the Nixon Watergate scandal. So, all sorts of crazy, corrupt things have happened in the 20th century's latter half involving, the American intelligence services. And I think, I wouldn't be surprised at all if some of these files were embarrassing to the CIA. And also the other area where, there could be some embarrassment people are speculating is with Martin Luther King. We know that he was under constant surveillance from J. Edgar Hoover's FBI. And we've seen various declassified documents around, alleging things like gay orgies and adultery and, Martin Luther King behaving basically very badly. And of course, he is, as close as you can get to a secular saint in the United States today. All of the roads are named after him. If they're not named Lafayette or Washington, they're called.
They're not
Martin
named
Luther
after Malcolm X and JFK as well. I mean,
So
assassination
really
tends to do that.
So in your mind, do you think that there could be some more embarrassing details about Martin Luther King that could come out? Could that be something? Or what else could be embarrassing? What, to the FBI or?
Yeah. I did speak with David Garrow, who is a respected biographer and an old-style liberal Democrat who wrote very well received biographies of Barack Obama and then MLK. And he seemed to think that was it for MLK in terms of the orgies. And so obviously, man was a bit of a hypocrite. I mean, that as feet of clay, I don't think that's a bad thing for people to know that. I think having secular saints is a very bad idea in a liberal democracy. We're meant to be judging people on things like competence and values rather than religious virtue, which is something else entirely. I do think we might find more out about Malcolm X. And as I said, I'm really very surprised that his name wasn't included in this release of documents. The Nation of Islam, we know, was like circles around Martin Luther King under constant surveillance and seen as a threat to national security. And so it's very possible that somewhere in this mountain of surveillance information, there is something saying about, people talking about wanting to kill Malcolm X or wanting to kill Dr. King and, the authorities not acting on it. And I am one of those people, I believe you should attribute it to stupidity rather than malice. And it's not actually, maybe the intelligence services may actually be at times highly intelligent. It's just very hard to filter the information, as I said, to make it make sense. And of course, in retrospect, historians, we're all experts in retrospect. I can't tell you what's going to happen tomorrow. And so you have to put yourself back in time, as it were, into the shoes of people who are gathering this information and who, in the case of Malcolm X and the case of Martin Luther King, didn't like and perhaps even hated the object of their surveillance. I mean, certainly Hoover and the FBI's view of Martin Luther King is pretty dreadful. So I think we'll find out more about that. And again, I think in a mature democracy, there's nothing wrong with knowing that. And some of these things would be a lot less controversial if they had been known decades ago. And I really think they could have been known.
I think one interesting hypothetical is that can kind of put the JFK files perhaps into context. Donald Trump was a miracle away from being killed. I mean, literally this close from being murdered during the campaign by a man called Thomas Matthew Crooks. And we know very little about him. We know very little about his motives. If he had succeeded in killing Donald Trump, I think there would be a whole host of conspiracies. People would want to know, what had happened there, why he did it, and all of this stuff, and how he got away with it. I mean, we know that the police were even informed about this guy on, a rifleman on a roof, just.
You mean he was known to the authorities? Yeah.
Well, exactly. So, but obviously he didn't succeed, and therefore people aren't as interested in exactly what happened there. And it didn't work out. So, and in his case, again, it looks like it was a lone mad kid who did it, but who knows? So, but because he didn't succeed, there isn't that interest there. And, it looks like that so-called conspiracy failed. Maybe you can just briefly touch on him, and I have one more question, and then we can end.
Yes, it's very interesting. I mean, these days we're all known to the authorities because all of our electronic communications are sieved, but, often with legal authority of a certain kind, which I hope isn't being abused. So someone like Thomas Crooks, if he has the electronic signature like any other domestic terrorist, which is how I think we should think of people like that. They are domestic terrorists, and just as any overreach by government agencies within the borders of the United States is, an inevitable in some ways consequence of their overreach outside borders. So he probably would have appeared, or if he has any kind of electronic trail, it would have been known. But then there are millions of potentially extreme people like that, which is why, say, in Britain, Keir Starmer calls anyone who disagrees with him far right. And I'm sure the communications of millions of people would fit his idea of far right. There isn't anything to suggest that Crooks had any affiliation. I would put him close to the seeker after celebrity. I mean, the John Hinckley shot Ronald Reagan. I mean, his motive, I have it in my notes. He wants to impress Jodie Foster. Wanting to be famous is, of course, specifically modern sickness, and one which is rampant, especially in the United States. Mark Chapman, who shot John Lennon, for a mixture of reasons, he wanted to emulate Holden Caulfield, a fictional character in The Catcher in the Rye. And he also felt that, he had a sort of personal resentment. He felt that had slighted him in some way, or life had slighted him. And I think Crooks would probably fall into the John Hinckley, Mark Chapman range, which is also that Charles Guiteau who killed President Garfield, the frustrated scriptwriter. I think that kind of profile cannot be discounted. And it must be said, and we must remember this, that Lee Harvey Oswald does have the profile of, as well as interesting other contexts, the profile of the frustrated, resentful lone nutter who hasn't got an entirely solid grip on reality. It does fit his profile as well. So he's not, that cannot be discounted for that reason. So this whole thing's very murky.
And is it right that the guy who killed Spencer Perceval, the UK Prime Minister in the 19th century, I think he was upset because he didn't get a job. I think there was some patronage issue.
Which again is it's a logical explanation and doesn't require a conspiracy. Sometimes people shoot powerful and famous people for very personal reasons and motives of their own. Yeah. The fact is, James Earl Ray definitely bought the weapon that was fired and found in across from the motel room where King was. There's no dispute that Sirhan bought his weapon, or that Lee Harvey Oswald bought his, although what he intended to do with it and whether he'd used it before is a good question. So it's okay to say we don't know, but I think the more that we do know, the better it is. And as I said, I don't believe it's a threat to democracy. Actually, I think it's very important to maintaining trust between the public and what are necessarily large, powerful and faceless agencies without which, the government couldn't run. I think it's very important to maintain that trust by having the maximum amount of transparency. I don't mean that everybody should be like Edward Snowden. I think he's a very bad person who did his, what was basically treason in a very bad way. And there's an element of Snowden in Oswald and Oswald in Snowden. These are people who clearly have some high-functioning abilities, but also feel slighted, feel that they haven't been given the credit they're due, and therefore become strangely interested in Russia and seeing whether that would reciprocate them.
So my final question is on the consequences of the assassinations of each individual. Now, it's my contention, just very briefly, that Robert F. Kennedy Sr. being killed didn't have much of, he wasn't going to get the Democratic nomination in 1968, just wasn't going to happen. MLK dying, it sort of made him into a martyr, but beyond that, again, probably didn't have a huge impact ultimately in American history. Malcolm X, ditto. But JFK being killed, I think, had a huge, impact. And I've actually interviewed Christopher Caldwell, the American historian, about this. He's written a lot about the 1960s. And, this is something that he told me he thinks was a real kind of corner or, sort of hinge in history. Because Lyndon Johnson was so radical and so liberal as a president as compared to... Right. And so effective and such a political genius as compared to John F. Kennedy, who was relatively conservative as a Democrat. And look what Lyndon Johnson does in the 60s with the immigration reform, with the Civil Rights Act, with the Voting Rights Act, basically beginning DEI, affirmative action, and revolutionizing, I think, America in so many ways, the Vietnam War and everything else. So can you just talk, perhaps, maybe you can disagree with some of my contentions there, but about the consequences of each murder?
Well, if we look at Martin Luther King and Malcolm X as the two charismatic faces of African-American liberation struggles in the 1960s, they're both murdered in a short space of time. And yet it's Malcolm X who emerges as the icon, as the hero, as the subject of Spike Lee's ludicrous biopic, and so on. So, in a way, there's a level playing field established because they're both murdered at roughly the same time, and yet Malcolm X emerges as the icon, and I think a large part of that has to do with the fact that white liberals had a romantic attachment to the idea of violent outsiderdom, rather than a very Christian, step-by-step idea of negotiated progress, which was Dr. King's, although where it might have ended is a good question, because he was quite far to the left and was particularly, say, against deepening the war in Vietnam. I mean, it became a real sticking point for him. But as I said, when it comes to those two, the historical outcome probably wasn't affected that much. Perhaps Martin Luther King might have kept Malcolm X from becoming the third face of it. But it was white liberals who anointed Malcolm X posthumously in that way. And maybe they would have dumped King for their own reasons if either or neither had lived. It's true. Robert F. Kennedy is a very interesting case because of JFK's assassination, Robert Kennedy carried a particular charge and a particular authority. And if, as you're saying, he had missed the chance to be the nominee in 1968, perhaps he would have come back in 1972. Perhaps it would have been RFK in 1980 rather than the clown prince of the Kennedy family, young Ted, unsafe in cars, who got the nomination. Perhaps he wouldn't have had Jimmy Carter in 1976. I mean, it goes on and on. Perhaps Ronald Reagan would not have come in. Maybe that's stretching it a bit. But the point is, I think RFK could have made, because of that peculiar authority that he had as the survivor of JFK, he could have made a further contribution that could have affected the development of Democratic Party in the 70s. And then I think Chris Caldwell is very much right about JFK. I think it's like the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in 1914 or the assassination of Alexander II in 1880. These are actually very significant hinges historically. It's a very good question. Assuming Kennedy would have won in 1964, as Johnson went on to do, he probably would have won in 1964.
I think that's without doubt. If you look at the opinion polls, he was one of the most, if not the most popular president.
Exactly. Yeah, and look, they had the Kennedys made promises to Martin Luther King and the civil rights activists before the 1960 election, and then basically dumped them. Would they have returned to them after winning again in 64? Possibly. They might have felt their second term was here. It's time to secure the legacy. Would the outcomes have been as ruthlessly managed as you're saying, as LBJ's were? Perhaps not. Perhaps it would have been incremental. And perhaps not all of the legislation that was passed would have been passed. But on that count, some of it, I believe, would have been passed. There's no doubt that it's time and not only come, but it had become irresistible. In foreign affairs, it's another interesting question. Would Kennedy have persisted in an aggressive or hostile stance to Russia? I think he probably would have. given, the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs, and given Khrushchev's intransigence and hostility, yes. And I think, it's worth asking, and of course Vietnam is the crucial question, is would JFK have been more effective at pursuing American interests or Western interests in the Cold War than LBJ was? And I think he would have. And we saw that, actually, when you read the transcripts from the Cuban Missile Crisis, in that Kennedy doesn't take the general's advice and wants to reduce the tension rather than wind it up as they're advising.
Well, he takes his brother's advice, which is another interesting connection, where Robert Kennedy is the one sort of cooling everything down. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's true. So, would Kennedy have been a better steward of American interest? Perhaps. Either way, it's a massive hinge. And either way, LBJ is not very good as a president. He effectively washes out in 1960. He gives up on it. He can't do it anymore. He's not credible to himself or anybody else. I don't think, that, despite the challenges of the decade, I don't think JFK, RFK as well, but I don't think he would have hit a wall in that way. So no, it is absolutely critical and crucial, more than the others were.
Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the GBN America YouTube channel.